Snowcrystal growled in anger at the grass Pokemon, raising her voice in unison with Rosie's. "That's not fair," she cried, hardly believing that they expected her to battle for them. "This isn't our fight." "Do you think we're just going to let you walk free?" the Tropius replied, giving her a cold stare. Snowcrystal had to wonder what had happened to these Pokemon to make them so hostile around strangers and so quick to assume things. She could hear Spark and Rosie still trying to argue with him, but she wasn't sure any of them would really be able to reason with the grass types. Suddenly, Wild Flame spoke up, causing everyone to glance at her in surprise. "All right, then," the Houndoom told her captors. "We'll fight for you." "What?" hissed Rosie, casting a furious glare at the dark type. "Are you crazy? I won't be able to fight." "True," the Ivysaur agreed, glancing at the Ninetales, "but you'll be here to guard the cave and alert us of any sign of danger." "No way!" Rosie shouted back defiantly. Snowcrystal gave Wildflame a confused look, and the Houndoom mouthed the words, "Don't argue," to her. Seeing the look in her eyes, Snowcrystal realized that Wildflame had thought of a plan, and gave Spark the same look, whispering, "Just go along with it." Before Spark could question her or Rosie could argue further, Snowcrystal spoke up. "We agree," she said, facing the grass Pokemon again, "as long as you let us go afterward." She then waited for an answer, ignoring the scathing looks of Rosie and Spark gave her. "We will let you go," the Tropius replied as he and the other grass Pokemon turned to leave. "That is, if you can prove to us you aren't traitors." He then took off after the others, leaving the four friends alone in the cavern. "Why did you say that?" Rosie hissed at Wildflame and Snowcrystal. "I don't want to defend this cave for these Pokemon after they've tried to imprison us." "Yeah," Spark agreed. "I don't want to get injured in battle for someone who—" "Quiet!" Wildflame interrupted, casting a nervous glance at the tunnel where the grass Pokemon had left. "Now let me tell you this quick, because some of them could be back at any minute. I told them we would fight because it's probably our best way of escape. When the battle starts, we can slip away back to this cave and find Rosie, who should be near the entrance, and attack the other guards if we have to, then make a break for it." "But they said the battle wouldn't be for a few days," Spark replied. "Are we going to have to wait here for that long?" "I'm afraid so," Wildflame replied. "But it's the only way we can get out of here without a high chance of getting hurt." Snowcrystal nodded, and reluctantly, Rosie did so too. Wildflame was right. This seemed like the easiest way, and while they were trapped, they could at least rest for the journey ahead of them. For the next 2 days, the four friends stayed within the cave, being given water and strange food every once in a while. Despite the situation they were in, and the desire to escape, Rosie and Spark were grateful for the chance to rest and to not have to travel with their painful injuries. Snowcrystal, however, was growing restless. She had to find some sort of clue about where Articuno was, but she couldn't even start to look for one while she was trapped, and it worried her to think of her home and the growlithe there who might soon be facing threats from the Houndour tribe. After a while of pacing around the cavern and worrying, Snowcrystal sat down beneath the starlight hole in the cave ceiling. It was the night of the second day they had to spend in the cave since being captured, and the next day was the day of the battle and the escape. Snowcrystal glanced at her three friends, who were already asleep. She turned her gaze to the section of starlit sky she could see through the ceiling, and was almost instantly reminded of her home in the mountains once again. She almost wished she were back there now, that she had never taken this quest, and was safe back in her snowy cave at home. "No," she whispered to herself, "I can't go home, not until I find out what made Articuno have to leave." She lay down on the cold stone floor, gazing at the stars for a moment longer before her thoughts slowly lulled her into a sleep. "Wake up," a voice hissed in Snowcrystal's ear. "It's time." Snowcrystal stirred, blinking in confusion at the Ivysaur that stood over her. "Time for what?" she asked, still a bit dazed after just waking up. "The battle," the Ivysaur calmly replied, and went to wake Wildflame. Snowcrystal sat up, shaking her fur free of dust, and waited, trying not to let her excitement or fear show. Today was the day they were going to escape. However, she could not shake off the lingering dread that something was going to go wrong. Pushing the thought from her mind, she went to stand beside Wildflame and Spark as they waited to be led out of the cave and toward the battle. Rosie sat a small distance away, trying not to act as if she was planning anything suspicious. After a moment, the 4 Pokemon were taken into a different cavern. Snowcrystal picked up a stronger scent of fresh air and grass, and figured that this cavern must be close to the cave's entrance. There was a large amount of powerful-looking grass types there, and Snowcrystal shuddered. She didn't want to imagine fighting them. She wondered how strong the fire-type Pokemon they had heard about were. As the Ivysaur from earlier made a brief few statements about the battle, Snowcrystal crouched down, hardly listening. Looking down at the crystal she had been given, she noticed how battered and worn it looked now. Scratches covered its shiny surface, and it was covered in bits of dust and dry mud. She felt guilty for letting Ice Claw's gift get in such a condition when it had been so special to him. A cry from the grass Pokemon around her jolted Snowcrystal out of her thoughts. Standing up quickly, she followed them as they made their way out of the cave, watching as Rosie was made to take her place at the cave's entrance with the other guards. She was trying to appear brave, but Snowcrystal could tell that she was scared. She tried to give Rosie a comforting look, but she wasn't sure the Ninetales could see her in the crowd of grass Pokemon. As the small army of Pokemon moved on, surrounding Snowcrystal, Wildflame, and Spark on all sides, they soon lost sight of Rosie. Worried, Snowcrystal glanced at every tree, rock, and bush, trying to remember them. She didn't want to get lost and be unable to find Rosie after they left the battle. Wildflame seemed to be doing the same thing as they walked, though none of the grass Pokemon noticed. Once Snowcrystal was starting to get a little tired, and Spark had started limping much worse, the grass Pokemon stopped at a large, rocky and grassy area near a stream. "We're here, I guess," Wildflame whispered to her friends. "Then where are the fire types?" Spark asked, looking around at the trees and at the groups of large boulders nearby, which could have easily made a den for Pokemon. Some of the grass Pokemon seemed just as confused as they were. "This is where they live now, right?" one of the younger ones asked. The Sceptile beside him nodded, looking around warily. "They might have been suspecting an attack and moved somewhere else last night," he called to the leading grass types. "You're probably right," another said. "Maybe we should—" His voice cut off without warning. Several columns of flame launched toward the group from all directions. "Get down!" Wildflame hissed, pushing Spark off his feet and out of the way as one of the blasts came near. Snowcrystal ducked her head as the flame seared by, then looked up to see the shapes of several fire Pokemon appearing from various hiding places. She had to duck again as they fired several more bursts of red-hot flame. Since Snowcrystal, Spark, and Wildflame had been in the center of the group, they had been mostly safe from the attacks. Many of the grass Pokemon, however, were wounded. "Don't just stand there," the Ivysaur shouted back at them. "Attack!" Most of the grass Pokemon either ran forward or shot a Razor Leaf attack at their enemies, while the fire Pokemon stayed where they were, still launching their attacks. Snowcrystal saw the Tropius from the cave launch himself into the sky and slam down on an unsuspecting Flareon. Another fire type, a Quilava, was wrenched into the air by Vine Whip and thrown forcefully onto the rocks before he even had a chance to attack. Despite this, it was the fire Pokemon who seemed to be dealing the most damage. Snowcrystal darted away from the main fighting, but there seemed to be enemies on all sides. "Hey!" shouted a Bayleaf, causing Snowcrystal to turn around. "What are you waiting for? Attack!" Snowcrystal ignored the shout, looking frantically around for Spark and Wildflame, who had gotten separated from her in the confusion soon after the battle had started. After a few worried moments, Snowcrystal spotted Spark's spiky yellow form and ran over to him. "Spark, where's Wildflame?" she asked, noticing that the Houndoom wasn't with him. "I don't know," Spark replied. "I had to avoid another flamethrower. And... look out!" Snowcrystal cried, knocking Spark out of the way as a massive thorny vine broke out of the ground and whipped toward them. Frantically, Spark and Snowcrystal scrambled away as more vines broke free from the earth. They darted further away, hearing the cries of several fire types who had gotten caught in the attack. "I've seen that before," Spark shouted breathlessly once they were out of range. "That's Frenzy Plant. How on earth did one of these wild Pokemon know Frenzy Plant?" "I don't know," Snowcrystal gasped. "Let's just find Wildflame and get out of here." She looked around, ignoring the sounds of battle. and soon spotted Wildflame darting to avoid one of the fire Pokemon, who was shouting something angrily at her. Snowcrystal only caught the word traitor. Wildflame fired a flamethrower in the Pokemon's direction, and it stopped chasing her. Hearing Snowcrystal shout, she began to head in the direction of the white Growlithe and Spark. Snowcrystal watched the Houndoom bound closer to them with long strides, avoiding the sparring Pokemon. "Stay there," Wildflame called to them, not wanting them to run toward her and into the commotion. "Once I'm there, follow me." The distance between Wildflame and Snowcrystal was closing, but as the Houndoom neared her friends, several razor-sharp leaves sped in her direction, cutting her back legs and causing her to stumble. Wildflame looked up to see a Meganium staring at her in anger, obviously mistaking her for one of the enemy fire Pokemon. "Don't attack me," Wildflame shouted at him, leaping to her feet. "I'm fighting for you, remember?" A moment later, she realized that she had stopped for too long. The same vines that Spark and Snowcrystal had seen erupted from the ground again, trapping all Pokemon unfortunate enough to be close by. Wildflame was one of them. The Houndoom let out a painful howl as the thorny vines wrapped around her middle and lifted her into the air before slamming her down against the rocky ground. Stars exploded in the Houndoom's vision, and she clawed and bit frantically at the vine as she felt it lift her into the air again. Snowcrystal stood frozen to the spot for a split second, Wildflame's screams of pain echoing in her ears. Then she was running towards the massive twisting vines that wrapped more tightly around the dark type and sent her crashing to the ground another time before lifting her up once more. Hardly believing what she was doing, the small Growlithe leaped toward the vines, opening her mouth and releasing a whirling blast of flames. Snowcrystal stared in disbelief as she watched her own attack, which looked like several columns of flames twisting together, strike the vines and burn through them. Wildflame was released, and as she fell to the ground, Snowcrystal ran over to her. The Houndoom stood up, luckily not badly injured. Snowcrystal's fire attack had hardly hurt her, and Snowcrystal had stopped the Frenzy Plant attack from doing any serious damage. "Snowcrystal," Wildflame whispered with a hint of pride in her voice. You learned Flame Wheel." Snowcrystal smiled back at the Houndoom, and the two of them ran toward Spark, who looked just as surprised. "You finally learned a new attack," Spark cried. "Now you can actually fight." "Yeah, sure," Snowcrystal replied nervously. "Let's just get out of here." Wildflame nodded, and the three Pokemon headed away from the battle, avoiding any remaining fire Pokemon that were still surrounding the area. Luckily, the three managed to make it away unnoticed, and they quickly scampered back in the direction of the cave, hearing the sounds of battle gradually fade away. "Well, that worked like a charm," Wildflame exclaimed, still excited about Snowcrystal's new attack. "Now we've got to find Rosie and get out of here." The three Pokemon ran toward the cave, Wildflame in the lead. However, when the cave came in sight, the Houndoom stopped, seeming suddenly worried. Confused, Snowcrystal walked up to her side, looking at the cave. What she saw filled her with dread. The guards in front of the cave had either fainted or run away, and she wasn't sure that one of the unconscious ones was actually still alive. All around the cave were signs of a struggle, and Rosie was nowhere to be seen. Nearly 3 days had passed since the night Redclaw and Stormblade had met up with Thunder. Because of Stormblade's injuries, the going had been painfully slow, and they had had to take long breaks often. Stormblade had attempted to talk to Thunder many times, but she had always ended up either yelling at him or ignoring him. Redclaw had tried to talk to her about why she seemed so angry, but she hadn't answered him either. Prey was scarce in the area, and though it had recently rained, there was little water to be found at all. It had soaked into the ground and turned it into mud, which had mostly dried under the heat of the sun. They had traveled east until they reached the burned forest, which they were now going around, heading in a northward direction. Redclaw was worried. Underneath the hot midday sun, there were very few trees or shelter in the area. The last time they had found a good source of water was 2 days ago. Redclaw was thirsty, though he wasn't worried for himself. As a fire type, he could go without water longer than most other Pokemon, but he was worried about the two Scyther. Thunder never complained of thirst, but Redclaw could tell that she was weakening. She had been thin and malnourished before, and the lack of food and water was making it all the worse for her. However, she had tried her best to hide that fact, and surprisingly, she had kept up with Redclaw well. For Stormblade, it was a different story. The injured Pokemon had grown weaker and weaker, not just from lack of food and water, but from his wounds as well. Even though Redclaw had been helping Stormblade walk, the Scyther had grown so frail that he had been forced to stumble along, using his injured leg as well as his good one, causing it to become even more painful than before. The bandages around his wounds had become filthy and blood-stained, and they were starting to stink. Stormblade's cough seemed to be gone for the most part, but other than that, he didn't seem to be getting any better, and they still hadn't found one Pokemon who knew anything about healing. Redclaw and Thunder walked on, the Arcanine supporting Stormblade along the way, when Stormblade suddenly slumped to the ground and collapsed. Redclaw turned toward him instantly, nudging the motionless Scyther with his snout. Stormblade didn't move. He was out cold. "Oh no," Redclaw whispered worriedly. Stormblade had collapsed before, but he had never passed out. Not since he and Redclaw had escaped Team Rocket's building. "He needs help," Redclaw murmured to himself, "and right now, what he needs most is water." "How very clever of you to realize that," Thunder muttered sarcastically, walking over to him. "My advice? Don't bother going to look for water. There isn't any here, and I doubt it would help anyway. At this point, there's not much hope for him." Redclaw noticed Thunder looking at Stormblade with a strange expression, and he thought she looked angry, though he couldn't tell what she was really thinking. "We have to try," he told her urgently. "We're going to stop and look for water. Maybe you should fly up above and see if there are any streams." "I've done that," Thunder muttered. "I did it twice yesterday and once the day before. There aren't any streams here. There were some when me and Stormblade passed this way before, but we were much closer to the human city and also in danger of poacher traps. I don't know if there are any other streams." "Well, it wouldn't hurt to check a little further," Redclaw told her. "And we've made progress this way. There has to be something. A stream leading to that destroyed forest, maybe?" "There probably is one," Thunder replied, finding it hard to speak due to thirst, "but none near, and searching for it would bring us way too close to the poachers. I guess I'll check north of here." She spread her wings and took off. Redclaw realized with guilt that it was hard for her to fly. Her wing was still injured from the fight with Volko. He felt bad for sending her out to search when she was so weak, but Stormblade needed it now. He sat down and waited, licking the dried blood from the cut on Stormblade's head. After a while, Thunder returned, looking exhausted. She staggered toward Redclaw, waving her scythe in the direction she had flown. "There aren't any streams," she told him, and before Redclaw could feel disappointed, she went on. "But I saw some sort of really old human town. It looked completely abandoned by whoever lived there, and there were Pokemon wandering freely in the streets, but no signs of humans. It would be worth looking there. There's always water in human cities, and rain could have collected in a lot of places. I'd say that's our best bet." Redclaw nodded. "We'll go together. You look too tired to fly anymore," he began, and Thunder gave him a seething glare. "We're going to have to wait for Stormblade to wake up. Let's just hope he's strong enough to make it." "How far was the town?" "Not far," Thunder replied. "It wouldn't take that long to reach it, though with Stormblade, of course it might." She gave Stormblade an annoyed glance. "I'm honestly surprised he's lasted this long," she muttered. Redclaw glared at her, but said nothing. Thunder turned away from Stormblade, seemingly uneasy around the injured Pokemon. "Anything we can do to wake him up?" she asked, clearly impatient. "I don't know," Redclaw told her. "We might just have to wait." He leaned down toward Stormblade, who was, surprisingly, starting to stir. Seeing that his friend was waking up, Redclaw carefully nudged his head, watching as Stormblade opened his eyes. The Scyther instantly closed them again, reluctant to try and stand up. "Thunder found a place that's bound to have water," Redclaw told him. "All we have to do is make it there, and we can rest." Stormblade slowly stood up, quickly leaning against Redclaw for support. Thunder watched him impatiently, seeming annoyed that it took him so long to stand. "Well, now that he's awake, let's get on with it," she growled. Redclaw nodded, pausing to scratch at his metal collar before following Thunder as the Scyther walked on ahead. Thunder stopped and waited for the Arcanine, who was still helping Stormblade. Redclaw looked at the injured Scyther and sighed. This was going to be a long walk. By afternoon, the 3 Pokemon had left the burned forest well behind them and came to the outskirts of the abandoned city Thunder had discovered. Redclaw stared at it uncertainly. They were standing in front of an old, faded sign placed on top of 2 tall wooden posts in front of the first buildings and ruined streets. There were human-made markings carved on the sign that looked damaged and worn. Redclaw turned to Thunder. It does look abandoned, he whispered quietly, still looking wary of entering. I flew over the town before, Thunder snapped. It's fine. All right, Redclaw replied, still nervous. Let's go. The 3 Pokemon walked under the archway created by the old sign. You sure there's water here? Stormblade asked, lifting his head weakly to look at Redclaw. Though the Arcanine was relieved that Stormblade looked a bit stronger, now that he knew they would probably find water soon. Redclaw was still fighting the lingering doubt that Stormblade would make it to a healer alive. The infections in his wounds had to be getting worse. There has to be some place where rainwater has collected, Redclaw told him. He motioned with his head toward the crumbling buildings and streets. Let's have a look around. He knew it would be easier to find water if Thunder flew around to search, but he also knew that she was weak, and he didn't want to ask her. She didn't offer to search either. As they walked further into the old city, Redclaw began to catch glimpses of Pokemon. Most of them were small, normal, or electric types, but there were a few larger species as well. All of them scampered away the moment the travelers came into their view. Redclaw tried to ask a Raichu if it knew where water was, but it darted into an alley before Redclaw could even finish his sentence. This place sure is strange, Thunder whispered quietly, glancing at Redclaw. I wonder why all the Pokemon here are so nervous, the Arcanine replied, pausing to glance around. After a short while, Redclaw and the others started to smell a putrid stench, and noticed several Grimer and a few muck lurking in dark alleyways. These alleyways were almost all coated in mud from the rainwater and strewn with debris, making them good places for Grimer to hide. Several small Pokemon darted fearfully in and out of the alleys, paying the Grimer and muck no heed. Whatever they were scared of, it certainly wasn't them. All the buildings were crumbling and old. Some had even collapsed. Very few of them still had doors, and several had broken windows. Every once in a while, a Pokemon would come in or out of one of the buildings, and Redclaw realized that they probably took shelter there. He caught a glimpse into one of the crumbling structures, but it was only filled with mud and old, useless pieces of some strange human items that he couldn't identify. I guess you were right, Thunder, Redclaw told the Scyther as they walked along. Guess it's safe to say there are no humans here. Wonder what made them have to leave. Don't know, Thunder replied, not seeming as curious as Redclaw was about the whole thing. The group stopped suddenly as they came upon a tall wall surrounding one of the ruined buildings. Along this wall were intricate carvings, each depicting a detailed image of a Pokemon. Curious, Redclaw walked over to it, careful to help Stormblade. He looked at each of the carvings around him, seemingly lost in thought. For a reason he couldn't describe, there seemed to be a strange air of mystery around the place. Thunder glanced at the section of the wall where a large door used to be. There could be some water in that building, she suggested, noticing that parts of the old building's roof were broken and rainwater could have easily collected inside. Redclaw nodded and walked toward the doorway in the wall, when 2 carvings, an Arcanine and a Scyther, caught his eye. Stormblade noticed them too, and looked around to see if there were any carvings of the species of his friends, but only found a growlithe one. The 3 Pokemon walked through the opening and into the large building, which seemed to be on the verge of collapsing. There was no water there, but something else caught Stormblade's attention. Look, he whispered. It's Articuno. Stormblade's voice was so quiet that Redclaw hardly heard him, but he followed the Scyther's gaze to a large, faded painting that had been badly torn, yet the image of the legendary bird could still be seen clearly. Redclaw could tell that if the painting had been in better shape, it would have been beautiful. Yeah? So? Thunder muttered, interrupting Redclaw's thoughts. It's only a stupid painting. There are lots of them here. She motioned with her scythe toward the opposite side of the room, where several damaged paintings hung from the wall or lay strewn across the floor. We came here for water, didn't we? She reminded them, and they followed her through a corridor and into another room. The ceiling was badly damaged there, and sunlight shone through onto the filthy floor. Around this room were several old statues, most of them broken, as well as slabs of stone depicting strange carvings. The strange soft floor underneath them was damp, but there was still no sign of any water. "Let's try somewhere else," Redclaw told the others quietly. "There's nothing here." He started to turn when he noticed Stormblade looking at something. He looked up to see one of the old carvings, one that was still placed on the wall. This one was different than most of the others. It depicted several small Pokemon of various species lying across the ground, either dead or dying. Redclaw noticed a growlithe among them. Above the dying Pokemon stood a Scyther, its blades raised above a tiny Eevee, ready to strike. "Well, that's lovely," Thunder muttered sarcastically, eyeing the carvings of the dead Pokemon. "Wonder what human made this? Someone like Master, I'm sure." "I don't know," Redclaw replied, wondering why the human had carved the picture in the first place. He looked around, noticing a few other carvings somewhat like it, depicting Pokemon battles or a predator stalking prey. However, none of them showed dead or dying Pokemon, apart from a Pidgey and one carving of a pouncing Persian. Maybe it was supposed to give a warning or something, Redclaw mused, glancing at the Scyther picture again. He turned back toward the way they had come. The Arcanine started to leave, but then stopped, noticing that Stormblade was still staring at the carving of the Scyther, with an expression that made it hard to tell what he was thinking. "What's wrong?" Redclaw asked him. Stormblade turned away from the carving as if being snapped out of a trance. "Nothing," he said quickly, limping over to Redclaw. "Let's look somewhere else. There's no water here at all." Redclaw nodded and they walked out of the building, leaving it and the strange wall of Pokemon carvings behind. They walked further down one of the many roads, seeing only a few Rattata who scampered away with frightened squeaks at the sight of them. After a short while, Thunder stopped suddenly. "I think I can see water up ahead," she told the others. "Follow me." Redclaw didn't see the water, but he followed Thunder as she led him across an old, cracked road, and through what had once been a small field. It was now nothing but mud and dust, strewn with debris from collapsed buildings. Thunder led them through the field into where a long, deep channel ran through part of the city, passing by them and nearing another section of buildings. Flowing through the channel, which Redclaw assumed must have once been some sort of canal, was water. It had to have come from the rain, Thunder stated, looking down at the water. It appeared dark and murky in some places, but it was flowing smoothly and would probably be the only relatively fresh water they were going to find anytime soon. "It doesn't look too bad," Thunder muttered. There was probably just a lot of dust that blew into it. Redclaw nodded as the three of them approached the water, and gently pushed Stormblade forward and towards it. "See? I told you we'd find water," he told him. "Good thing it rained a little while ago. Now go get a drink." Stormblade immediately stumbled to the water's edge and leaned down, plunging his head into it and drinking as much as he could. It tasted strange to him, but he was far too thirsty to care. Redclaw quickly followed him to the water's edge, and Thunder walked up to it as well. As Thunder bent down to drink the water, Redclaw stiffened, realizing that a faint but still foul stench was slowly wafting toward him from it, and growing stronger. "Wait!" he shouted. Thunder paused and looked up at him with a confused expression. Redclaw dashed toward Stormblade, pushing the Scyther away from the water. "It doesn't smell right," he cried, and Stormblade simply looked at him, confused, while Thunder bent down to give the water a closer sniff. Almost instantly she bared her teeth in disgust and backed away. "It smells disgusting," she exclaimed. "It's getting worse," Redclaw mused, feeling the strange scent drifting more strongly toward him. Something caught his eye, and he glanced into the water, seeing a thin trail of something dark and purplish flowing through it. A feeling of dread crept over him as his eyes followed the trail to a place further down in the canal. He froze as he noticed a large muck heave itself out of the water and slowly ooze into a dark alleyway. Thunder noticed the muck too, and backed away from the water as if afraid to touch it, looking thoroughly disgusted that she had been about to drink it. Redclaw cast a panicked glance at Stormblade, who was looking at Thunder with a puzzled expression. Obviously he hadn't seen the muck, and didn't know what was wrong with the water. Redclaw fought to keep his worry under control and looked at Stormblade again. So, how are you feeling? He asked, instantly realizing how stupid he sounded. What do you mean by that? Stormblade asked, a hint of panic beginning to show in his eyes as he realized by Redclaw's tone of voice that something was definitely wrong. Redclaw opened his mouth to speak, knowing that making Stormblade panic would just make things worse, but Thunder spoke before him. He means you've just ingested poison, Thunder told him calmly. Nice going. Redclaw shot her a glare and turned to Stormblade, who looked suddenly very frightened. Poison? The Scyther whispered quietly. Reluctantly, Redclaw nodded. There was a muck in the water, he said worriedly. I'm sorry. I should have checked it out first. I knew something wasn't right. It's his own fault, Thunder shouted, pointing to Stormblade with her scythe. He just started drinking the water without even bothering to smell it first. Stormblade shrank back from Thunder's gaze. Redclaw walked to his side and stood beside him. It's not his fault, he told Thunder. He didn't know, and he's hurt. If I was in as much pain as he was, I probably wouldn't have noticed it in time either. It isn't anyone's fault. Thunder's eyes narrowed and she turned away, annoyed that Redclaw had stood up for Stormblade. So what do you suppose we do? She asked, turning her head enough to give Redclaw another annoyed look. Redclaw lowered his head, feeling helpless, and knowing that if Stormblade really had swallowed any poison, it could start to affect him at any minute. I don't know, he admitted.